In the 1970s, inside of government labs and behind the locked doors of classified facilities, something strange was happening. Nuclear scientists with top-secret Q clearance began reporting flying orbs of light and disturbing poltergeist activity that tormented them in the middle of the night. The CIA was running psychic spy programs where agents claimed they could see across continents, sometimes across time. Take, for instance, Pat Price, a former police commissioner turned elite remote viewer. His visions were so accurate, so disturbing, that some believed he had pierced the veil of national security itself. And just as the CIA prepared to bring him deeper into the fold, he was found dead under mysterious circumstances in a Las Vegas hotel room. Was it natural causes or something else? Then there's the famous Uri Geller, an Israeli psychic who claimed he could bend spoons, read minds, even influence electronics with his psychokinetic abilities. The CIA was interested and they decided to study him. Many saw him as a gifted prodigy, others a total fraud, and some a double agent. In chapter 11 of her incredible book Phenomena, author Annie Jacobson takes us deep into this shadowy world where science, secrecy, and the paranormal collide. And with that, let us commence the riffs and the read-through. In the early days of the Cold War, back in April 1953, CIA Director Allen W. Dulles gave a now famous speech at the National Alumni Conference of the Graduate Council of Princeton University, alerting America to the communists' most powerful secret weapon, brain warfare. Its aim is to condition the mind so that it no longer reacts on a free will or rational basis, but responds to impulses implanted from the outside, Dulles declared. To achieve this goal, Dulles said, communists were running single-target programs such as brainwashing of captured prisoners of war in Korea. The ability to influence key leaders of small groups of people through some kind of thought-influencing operation was also seen as a viable threat. One individual who continued to interest the CIA in this regard was Uri Geller. Declassified documents show that CIA analysts were concerned by an ability of Uri Geller's they called mind projection, a unique ability whereby he forces the researchers to name a city previously written down by him with apparently a high order of accuracy, wrote an analyst with the Office of Research and Development. Geller's posse of critics declared him a fake and a fraud, but declassified documents indicate that the CIA did not necessarily agree. Quote, "It may prove worthwhile to explore pursuing some carefully controlled experiments with Geller over and above experiments TSD, Technical Service Division, is funding," suggested the ORD analyst, albeit with much tighter controls. After New Scientist ran a 16-page story on Geller accusing him of possibly wearing a radio receiver that can be concealed in a tooth, the CIA had Geller's mouth examined by a dentist who found no sign of an implant. When the magician James Randi speculated that Geller's assistant and friend, Shippy Strang, helped him cheat, the CIA denied Strang access to Geller during the experiments. According to special management guidelines for the SRI Paranormal Project, stricter controls would now include, quote, strip down, removing rings, wristwatches, etc., and put on a special lab garment, jumpsuit, x-rays done on a spot basis during experimentation, limited to the chest, hands, and skull ultrasound. If Geller could plant a word in a person's mind through mind projection, he could ostensibly influence that person's actions. And that idea was of national security concern to the CIA. There was also mounting evidence that Geller's alleged powers produced secondary effects. A scientist with the Army Research Institute for Behavioral and Social Sciences agreed, quote, "Perhaps the most important consequence of the Geller craze is that a number of less celebrated individuals, particularly children and teenagers," definitely interesting, reportedly are able to bend metal after watching Geller do it, which is what happened on November 23, 1973, after Geller walked into a London radio studio for a live on-air experiment with a veteran British broadcaster named Leslie Ronald Jimmy Young. BBC Radio 2's Jimmy Young show had an audience that extended throughout England into Ireland and Scotland. After Geller arrived, Young welcomed him to the BBC and suggested that they get started right away. A few minutes into the interview, Young took out a large key identified as an Automobile Association telephone box key from his pocket and asked Geller to bend it. Quote, "I did what I usually do, laying my hand over the key and wishing it to bend," wrote Geller in a 1975 memoir. Geller was nervous, he said, having recently been unable to demonstrate psychokinesis on Johnny Carson's Tonight Show.
But we're back. Uri was telling me you don't feel what, strong tonight?
I don't feel strong. It's not all tonight. Right now I'm feeling being pressed, and then I can't.
Well, I'm not trying to press you. I'm really not.
You're only telling me, well, will you try that or that or that?
But today there was excitement in the air. A group of radio engineers had left their booth and gathered around Geller to observe. With his hand over the key, Geller concentrated. He told people all over the United Kingdom that they should summon their own psychokinetic powers at this exact moment and bend metal in their homes, spoons, forks, keys, anything. Quote, "If there are any broken watches in your home, please concentrate on them and try to make them work," instructed Geller. After a few moments of concentrating on the audience, Geller took his hand away from Jimmy Young's key. Live on national radio, Jimmy Young shouted, "It's bending, right in front of me, I can't believe it." There was clapping and cheering throughout the studio.
In an hour or two, it'll be more bent, that's the point, that when nobody touches it, I'm gone.
Young spoke of how crazy it was to be sitting in the BBC studio and watching metal bending right in front of him as if it were alive. A producer rushed in and handed Young a note. Then an engineer ran in with a message, and after that, another radio producer came forward with a handful of caller notes. Someone shouted, quote, "The entire BBC switchboard is lit up like a Christmas tree." Calls came into the station from all over, Young announced on air. Across the United Kingdom, citizens were reporting metal objects in their homes inexplicably bending. A woman in Surrey said that she'd concentrated and her gold bracelet bent. A woman in Harrow said she was stirring soup while she was concentrating and now her soup spoon was bent. A watchmaker called up to say the hands on one of his clocks, frozen for years, were moving again. People wanted to believe in psychokinesis, and now apparently many of them did. This is what the CIA called secondary consequences. All over Great Britain, people believed that they had bent metal with their own minds. Still in London, the following night, Geller appeared live on BBC television on the Dimbleby Talkin' Show. He bent and then broke a fork, started a broken watch, and reproduced a drawing hidden in a sealed envelope. Seated beside him were two scientists he did not know, King's College professor John Taylor and South African zoologist and anthropologist Lyell Watson. I believe Lyell Watson was cited in the Gateway paper, if I'm not mistaken. So that's potentially interesting, at least indirect correlation here. Both scientists express wonder. Quote, "I believe this process," declared Professor Taylor. "I believe that you actually broke the fork here and now."
But I do believe that under God and outside our universe, or outside our galaxy, or outside in our cosmos, or who knows, beyond our cosmos, there are intelligences. I don't know how they look, if it's computers, if it's, I don't know. But I do believe that there are higher civilizations, much more intelligent than we are. For them to do things like that, it's simple. Okay, I know. You see here, he doesn't agree.
All right. I can accept that at all.
But
look, they had to channel, the force had to be there, it came from your finger. What we should do first is investigate very carefully how this process occurs. I believe this process. I believe that you actually broke the fork here and now.
Yes.
Variation on what the CIA's Ken Kress called, quote, conscious conversion moments were now happening live on TV. Before we pull away from the scene and conclude most of our discussion about Geller, there is a particularly novel angle to what you just heard there if you know the history. So Geller was brought onto the scene into these studies at SRI by the controversial parapsychologist Dr. Andrea Puharich. But there was definitely more than just straight up scientific inquiry going on here. There was something mystical at play. Because according to both Puharich and Geller, Uri wasn't just performing parlor tricks, he was in contact with a non-human advanced intelligence. This intelligence identified itself as spectra. It communicated to them through hypnosis and channeling, and could even express itself through electronics, radios, televisions, etc. In his book, The Invisible College, researcher Jacques Vallée references these interactions with a sort of nice mix of intrigue and caution, suggesting that the Geller-Puharich dynamic was really blurring the lines between genuine anomalous phenomena, potential psychological manipulation, and that there might even be some stagecraft at play. But it does seem like Puharich and Geller truly were convinced that spectra was real, that it was this benevolent presence. They saw themselves as a part of a larger mission to assist humanity's sort of psychic evolution. So whether spectra was a complete hoax, a psychological projection of Geller and Puharich's unconscious, some mix of the two, or a genuine non-human entity, whatever the case may be, it remains one of the most intriguing and strange threads of this entire exploration. So now back to the chapter. The following day, as part of a psychokinesis experiment for the British tabloid newspaper Sunday People, estimated circulation 3 million, Geller agreed to concentrate hard at 12:30 p.m. London time and shout out the word bend. Quote, "I was at the Orly airport in Paris at the time," Geller recalls. "I concentrated hard starting at 12:15 in an attempt to send thoughts and energies across the channel. At exactly 12:30, I shouted bend." Reader reports flooded the newspaper's offices the following day. The newspaper printed a tabulation of readers' results. Quote, "Clocks and watches restarted, a total of 1,031. Forks and spoons bent or broken, a total of 293. Other objects bent or broken, a total of 51. Overnight, Uri Geller became front-page news across England and throughout Europe. The media referred to Geller mania as a force akin to Beatlemania. Cover stories about him appeared in Paris Match, Der Spiegel, Norsk Ukeblad, and Apu? Not familiar with that one. Geller was invited to give demonstrations in Japan, Germany, Sweden, Denmark, Holland, and Norway. From defense officials to religious leaders to celebrities, powerful individuals wanted to see for themselves whether Geller's abilities were real. In Oslo, he was invited to the home of Alv Jacob Fostervoll, the Norwegian Minister of Defense. In Italy, he went to meet with the Archbishop of Florence. In France, he was the guest of Brigitte Bardot. In America, meanwhile, a group of prominent scientists formed a coalition to discredit him. The cosmologist Carl Sagan was particularly offended by the public's acceptance of Uri Geller. Together with Martin Gardner, Ray Heyman, Paul Krutz, and James Randi, the skeptics created the Committee for Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal to make their position known. Quote, "The more serious-minded among us are starting to ask, what is going on," wrote Sagan. "Why the sudden explosion of interest, even among some otherwise sensible people, in all sorts of paranormal happenings? Are we in retreat from the scientific ideas of rationality, dispassionate examination of evidence, and sober experimentation that have made modern civilization what it is?" Sagan and his colleagues expressed anger over the fact that any American scientist would waste time studying extrasensory perception and psychokinesis. It was the duty of their committee, he wrote, to force a confrontation between what he believed was a battle between the, quote, rational and irrational. Sagan lamented, "In the past, the raising and answering of such questions has been left to commentators and journalists. This time around, however, some scientists are beginning to fight back." Fight back as their group would, it had no bearing on the decisions made at CIA. The agency continued its research in paranormal phenomena in general, and Uri Geller in particular. Geller's actions and his purported abilities had real-world consequences, rational or irrational. Nowhere was this more evident than in a bizarre series of happenings in late 1974. They invited Geller and a small group of nuclear weapons engineers who worked at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, one of two nuclear weapons laboratories in the United States. The CIA closely followed the situation. It was, and remains, a cause for alarm. Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory is located in Livermore, California, roughly 30 miles east of Stanford Research Institute. Quick aside, because we don't have this context from reading the rest of the book, Stanford Research Institute, SRI, is the sort of locus for a lot of this government intelligence agency, military-sponsored research into psi phenomena, the paranormal, remote viewing, telekinesis, all of the stuff that we're talking about. There are key figures there that are scientists, like Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ. You'll probably recognize this picture that I'm going to flash up from previous videos I've done, because these guys are just, once again, centrally involved in a lot of this experimentation. So they're really key figures in the history of the government's interest in psi phenomena. And they're both still alive and still active now. They're both in their 80s, but Hal is very much active. I'm not sure about Russell, what he's involved in, but yeah, Hal Puthoff is around and he's still doing very interesting and in some cases it seems like anomalous work. All right, so anyway, I'll just start that part over. Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory is located in Livermore, California, roughly 30 miles east of the Stanford Research Institute. In keeping with its mission statement, pushing the frontiers of nuclear weapons design and engineering, in the mid-1970s, Livermore scientists were developing new nuclear warheads and designing emerging weapons technologies that included classified laser systems and high-performance computers. Among these scientists and engineers was a small group closely following the Geller phenomena. If Geller's psychokinetic abilities were genuine, this group wanted to know whether and under what circumstances these abilities might be a national security threat to their work. Scientists and researchers working with Geller at SRI had reported that both inside and outside the lab, strange things sometimes occurred. Otherwise reliable equipment malfunctioned when Geller was around, objects disappeared then reappeared, computers crashed, magnetic tape became demagnetized. There was precedent for this kind of occurrence. Scientists called it the Pauli effect, named after theoretical physicist Nobel laureate Wolfgang Pauli. The Pauli effect had been coined after numerous instances were noted in which Pauli was present and technical equipment malfunctioned, fell, broke, or sustained unusual damage. On one occasion in February 1950, during a visit to Princeton University, the cyclotron that Pauli had come to observe inexplicably caught fire. Pauli wrote an article on the subject titled, quote, Background Physics, in which he discussed the relationships between physics, the conscious, and the unconscious. In homage to the Pauli effect, SRI scientists and researchers started calling the odd occurrences that were happening around them the Geller effect. A few notes on Wolfgang Pauli. Not only is he a Nobel laureate, the reason that he was interested in the conscious and the unconscious and the psyche and its effects on reality, in part at least, is due to his relationship with Carl Jung. So Pauli, it's now known, there's actually a whole book of their correspondence between Pauli and Jung. Pauli was actually a patient of Jung's. That doctor-patient relationship eventually blossomed into a mutual intellectual admiration and a friendship. And like I said, there's a whole book now of their correspondence. They were both particularly interested in synchronicity. So this is where his interest in the conscious and the unconscious is coming from. And it's a very, very interesting relationship that Jung and Pauli had. Anyway, one theory behind this phenomena called associationism, the philosophical idea that like a chain reaction, each experience informs or influences the next experience. This concept has been given various names across the historical record. In 400 BC, Sophocles wrote about the self-fulfilling prophecy, a prediction that directly or indirectly causes that prediction to manifest, as in Oedipus Rex. The Tinkerbell effect is a more modern way of describing situations that exist because people insist they exist. For the CIA in the 1950s, the controversial anesthesiologist Henry K. Beecher studied the placebo effect, a remarkable phenomenon whereby a harmless pill or simulated treatment produces real-world physiological effects in humans. And the Thomas theorem states that if, quote, if men define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. Important to this story is the fact that the perception of an event or situation, real or imagined, rational or irrational, normal or allegedly paranormal, can cause consequential actions to occur. In the winter of 1975, Uri Geller returned to Northern California at the behest of Livermore scientists for a series of classified psychokinesis tests. The tests were recorded on videotape, audio tape, and film. Because everyone involved with the experiment except Geller carried a top-secret Q clearance, that's a clearance for nuclear secrets, the Atomic Energy Commission, briefly renamed the Energy Research and Development Administration, assigned a security officer named Ron Robertson to oversee the national security issues between itself, Livermore, and the CIA. Kit Green served as the contract monitor for the CIA. Kit Green, we should give a little background on him because he's another one of these key figures that's involved in a lot of these formerly classified programs. He's a medical doc. He served as this kind of scientific oversight for a lot of this stuff as well. Again, still active today. And interestingly, as they actually cover later in the book, he is one of the people who's investigating anomalous injuries that people sustain due to contact with UAPs. So again, one of these figures who's just orbiting around a lot of this very novel and juicy, murky territory. The program involved half a dozen nuclear physicists and engineers, Green confirms, because of, quote, ongoing security issues. Geller was a foreign national whose potential role with the Mossad was yet unresolved. Arrangements were made to test Geller off-site. The scientists set up their experiments in a laboratory adjacent to Lawrence Livermore, an old wooden World War II barracks on University of California property. 2 sets of experiments were to take place. In the first, high-quality lasers were fired at a target. Could Geller interfere with the beam? For the second test, scientists placed magnetic computer program cards in a lead container and sealed it. Could Geller affect what was inside? He did a series of psychokinesis tests over several days, and the results of one of the tests was declassified. Quote, the magnetic pattern stored on the iron oxide layer of magnetic program card was erased, wrote Ron S. Hawk, one of the Livermore scientists. Quote, further experiments are warranted. In an interview in 2015, Kit Green summarized the Livermore group's conclusion. Quote, the determination was that from a close distance, Geller could affect matter and materials, but he could not do it from far away. Yet it was not the result of the tests that were the most troublesome, says Green. It was the strange effect Geller seemed to have on several of the nuclear physicists. Each night after finishing up their work with Geller, the Livermore scientists went home. Each morning, in keeping with nuclear clearance security protocols, the scientists were required to report anything unusual that had happened overnight. After the second day of tests, AEC security officer Ron Robertson called Kit Green at CIA headquarters. Quote, he told me there was a serious problem, recalls Green. Several of the nuclear engineers had reported seeing things they could not rationally explain. These included, quote, items flying across the room, lights flashing, a 6-inch ball of light rolling down the hallway. One scientist reported seeing a flying orb, remembers Green. I think that's particularly interesting because obviously there's this huge fervor around orbs now, but I'd be surprised if that fervor was extant in 1975 when this occurred. So I find that to be pretty novel. Speaking of novelty, one of the scientists claimed to have seen a large raven perched on a piece of furniture inside his home. Privately, Green thought these sounded like, quote, poltergeist events from folklore. The AEC was concerned, and so was the CIA. I traveled to San Francisco, Green says, to determine what could be causing these hallucinations. I was instructed to perform pathology tests on the Livermore scientists. Were these people going mad? Green flew to San Francisco and met with the scientists individually. Quote, I examined them, he says, conducted extensive interviews and tests. My conclusion, there was no pathology here. These people were straight up. These were people who had more polygraph exams each year than I had. They were not psychologically impaired. So what was going on? One of the scientists confided in Green about a particular incident he could not get out of his mind. This one is wild, my friends. It happened in his bedroom in the middle of the night. It made no rational sense, except he woke up his wife and she saw it too, Green recalls. Quote, he told me that he saw a disincarnate arm rotating like a hologram, meaning an arm that was free-floating, not attached to a body. Quote, an arm wrapped in some kind of gray cloth. Instead of a hand, the arm had a hook. He talked about the horror of seeing this hook floating over the foot of his bed, how it rotated like it was on a spit. What? Green was bedeviled. Perhaps what was going on was some kind of psychological operation, he thought, either by an enemy intelligence service or perhaps even the CIA. Quote, holograms were just coming online, Green says, although the technology was mostly classified at the time. He also knew there existed a long-standing rivalry between scientists at SRI and Livermore and remembers wondering, was this some kind of confidence trick? He confronted Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ. So again, remember, Puthoff and Targ are these physicists who work for SRI, this rival organization that's also studying and testing similar phenomena. He confronted Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ. I asked Hal and Russ to meet me in my hotel room. Green recalls, I was furious. The scientists at Livermore were terribly upset, Green said. Quote, the entire program was in jeopardy. I asked what the hell was going on. They swore to me they had nothing to do with any of it. My yelling was interrupted by a loud banging on the door. Green answered the knock. Standing in front of me in the hallway of the motel was a man in a gray suit. He asked me something. I said, wrong room, and closed the door. The man turned and left, and I watched him go. I noticed there was something unusual about him. One of the arms of his suit jacket was pinned up. The man had one arm, says Green. Hal Puthoff confirms that he saw it too. So just to zoom in on how incredibly odd this is. One of the scientists, again, somebody who is subject to the most rigorous mental testing imaginable, sees a disincarnate rotating arm at the foot of his bed, and as does his wife. So it's not just him. And then the following day, Kit Green, the doctor from the CIA who flies in to investigate all of this insanity that's being reported, ends up seeing a man with one arm in a gray suit. And there was also something gray on this disincarnate rotating arm. So weird. Green concluded that what was going on had to have been some kind of high technology psychological operation, one that involved holograms, lasers, and small unmanned aerial vehicles, all advanced technologies that were just coming online as black programs at CIA in the mid-1970s. I wish she would drop a source for that, because I want to know how you know that unmanned aerial vehicles, lasers, and holograms were black tech that was just coming online in the 1970s. That's super fascinating. As an intelligence officer and neurophysiologist, not an advanced weapons expert, Green remembers thinking that whatever classified technology was involved, it was above his level of security clearance. But as a medical professional, he was concerned about the real-world results that transpired. Quote, "Rational or irrational," says Green, two nuclear scientists who worked on U.S. nuclear weapons programs at Livermore drew their own conclusion. Quote, "As far as I know, two of the Livermore scientists quit," he says. "It was the Thomas theorem in action. If men define situations as real, they are real in their consequences." The scientists had apparently perceived the incidents to be some kind of omen or message, that they were not supposed to work on nuclear weapons development anymore, says Green. I just can't get over how wild that story is. That, again, just to reiterate, that you have the most decorated, mentally stable scientists in the country experiencing truly paranormal, truly hair-raising phenomena like orbs and ravens manifesting and rotating arms, literally being driven mad by something unexplainable. It's so crazy. And before we get into the final part of this chapter, it concerns another just incredibly fascinating figure from this period of history when the intelligence agencies were investigating psi phenomena, remote viewing, etc. And it's a remote viewer by the name of Pat Price. So Pat was a particularly standout talent in terms of remote viewing, apparently. Even according to some of the stories in this book, getting better results than famous remote viewers like Ingo Swann. Even the way that he comes onto the scene is extremely strange. Hal Puthoff, again, one of the scientists experimenting on this, maybe Russell Targ was there as well, they were out purchasing a Christmas tree, and Pat Price happened to be at this lot where they were buying a Christmas tree, and they had this weird exchange where Pat Price was sort of asking them what they do for a living, and they indicated, well, we do stuff at SRI that we can't really talk about. And he said something to the effect of like, I might be able to help with that. Like, let me know if you ever need help with that. And the circumstances were so strange that when he eventually did come on board this project, he was investigated by, I think it was the CIA, I could be wrong, because his sudden emergence was just so strange and coincidental that they thought something had to be up with him. And to give you even more of an idea of how remarkable Pat Price was, Price consistently delivered highly specific, verifiable intelligence. For instance, in one test, he described a Soviet weapons facility in Semipalatinsk in just stunning detail, including large gantry cranes and a subterranean structure, which satellite imagery later verified. In another case, he remote viewed a secret NSA facility in West Virginia. He named personnel, listed equipment, drew detailed interior layouts. This information was so accurate and so sensitive that it caused a panic within the intelligence community. So his skills weren't just intriguing, they were operationally useful, and that terrified people. And to get even juicier, according to some sources, Price even remote viewed underground alien bases. Of course, this is controversial, but from the scientists at SRI to the CIA themselves, and other still living remote viewers for that matter, it seems like everyone universally praised his abilities. So anyway, now on to the final part of this chapter concerning just the incredibly fascinating figure, Pat Price. The psychic research program at SRI was falling apart. Pat Price told Puthoff and Targ it was time to say goodbye. He had decided to make real-world use of his extrasensory talents. He said he'd been offered a stake in a West Virginia mining company searching for coal veins. His plan had always been to make a small fortune using his extrasensory abilities and then retire. What Price did not tell Puthoff and Targ, but what declassified documents reveal, was that he had been hired away from SRI by the CIA. Quote, "To achieve better security," states one memo, "all of the operations-oriented testing with the contractor, i.e. SRI, was stopped and a personal service contract with Price was started. Price now worked directly for the agency, with a personal handler in Washington, D.C. What Price did for the CIA remains a mystery. Those files have never been declassified despite multiple FOIA attempts." I got to comment on that quickly too, because, so much of this stuff has seemingly been declassified. What could still be so sensitive that it remains classified, 45 years later? I'm definitely curious, because a lot of these Cold War documents have been declassified. I mean, this book does an incredible job exploring a lot of it. But yeah, why he in particular, his time with the CIA, remains classified, man, I would love to know. We do know that the partnership between the CIA and Price had a tragic ending. In July 1975, Price was in Washington meeting with his handler when he reached out and made contact with old friends. According to both Hal Puthoff and Kit Green, Price told these friends he'd soon be spending a few days gambling in Las Vegas, and suggested that they meet him there. They agreed, and on July 14th, Price checked into the Stardust Hotel. Later that evening, he had dinner with the two friends in the hotel restaurant. The meeting was cut short when Price announced he didn't feel well and he was heading up to his room for a rest. When he didn't return, his friends went to his room to check on him. They found him in the bed, in cardiac arrest. Paramedics were called to the scene. EMTs tried to resuscitate him, but his heart did not respond to defibrillators. Pat Price was rushed to the emergency room where he was pronounced dead on arrival. Kit Green says he traveled to Las Vegas to review the autopsy report. Again, remember, Kit Green is an MD. Quote, "There was no report," remembers Green, "because no autopsy was performed. The coroner said a man had shown up with a briefcase full of Price's medical records and engaged hospital officials in a discussion, then waived the autopsy requirement on the grounds that Pat Price had died of a heart attack. At SRI, all kinds of rumors began to spread among the scientists and the physicists, including talk that Pat Price might have been killed. Possible assassins included the KGB, the CIA, even the Church of Scientology. In 1972, the Army's medical intelligence officer had warned that the KGB was, quote, developing a way to use psychokinesis to stop the human heart. As for the CIA, recent Church Committee congressional hearings had revealed that agency engineers had created a heart attack gun capable of shooting a poison pellet into a victim whose death would appear to have been a heart attack. According to Jacques Vallée, when the FBI learned that Pat Price was a Scientologist, the church became suspect. Quote, "After a raid against the offices of the Church of Scientology in Los Angeles, the FBI came to believe, falsely, that Price was used by the Scientologists as a spy against the CIA," Vallée wrote in his journal. So if you are familiar with Jacques Vallée, and you know him as this prolific author on the UFO topic, he actually was involved with SRI in the 70s. So again, just another incredibly fascinating figure that was directly involved in this stuff. Final bit here. In a move to disassociate itself from additional controversy, the CIA withdrew from its lead position in classified anomalous mental phenomena research. Pat Price was dead, Ingo Swann was in New York, Uri Geller was thought to be working for Mossad. The fate of the SRI program was up in the air. A Cold War chill set in. Was this the end of US government phenomena programs, or a new beginning? Spoiler. It may be the end of this chapter in this read-through, but it was not over. Not by a long shot. The deeper you dive into this murky chapter of history, into Project Stargate and really all of the government-funded psychic research, the harder it is to fully dismiss. There's just too much data, too many credible people and anecdotes to wave it all away as fantasy. When it comes to Geller, his story is just tangled with celebrity controversy, possible manipulation from a number of sources, Puharich, Mossad, and who knows what else. And when it comes to spoon bending, when it comes to these feats of what could be stage magic, that's all one thing. But how do we explain the quote-unquote Geller effect? How do we completely write off nuclear scientists with top secret clearance reporting that he really did perform feats of ESP? Is all of it fabricated? Is all of it a work? Or could there really be something there when it comes to Geller? Now, when it comes to Pat Price, the specificity of his visions, the intelligence-grade data that he produced, and of course the really strange circumstances surrounding his sudden death, it raises questions that still haven't been answered. Questions that are, to this day, for some reason, locked away in the CIA's classified vault. And of course, why that is, I guess we can only speculate. But as long as we are speculating, the idea that he got taken out because he remote viewed some things he wasn't supposed to remote view in those alien bases, what a sexy angle. But rather than speculate further in this transmission, I really can't recommend Annie Jacobsen's Phenomena enough. Trust me, Chapter 11 is really only the tip of the iceberg. Also, if you want to hear more of this story from the very people who experienced it, check out the documentary Third Eye Spies. And on a final note, similar to what I've been saying at the end of all of my videos on this topic as of late, this is more than stories. You don't need permission from any entity. You don't need to be let into any classified program. You really can, and I hope you do, explore the boundaries of your own consciousness. You can meditate, you can achieve altered states, you can practice remote viewing and try to have OBEs, out-of-body experiences if you want to. It is all psychical terrain that is open to you if you choose to explore it, and you can draw your own conclusions. And with that, I do appreciate your attention, my friends. I would also greatly appreciate if you would like, subscribe, comment, share, feed that algorithm. Also, look up Third Eye Drops wherever you listen to audio podcasts. We've got hundreds of mind melds with some truly brilliant beings. And myself and hundreds of other seekers would love to riff with you over at patreon.com/Third Eye Drops. It is not only one of the best ways to directly support this channel. You get access to a patron-only Discord server. You can join us for Zoom hangs. You can get rewards like stickers, pins, shirts, and more. I would love nothing more than to riff with you there. Much love. Until either then or next time.